Elvis Presley wasn't invited to the White House that day, but he showed up anyway. And what he asked the president made no sense. The airplane hummed at 30,000 feet above the American darkness. It was past midnight on December 21st, 1970, and most passengers aboard American Airlines Flight 82 from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. were asleep, mouths open, dreaming ordinary dreams. But in first class, one man was wide awake. He sat forward, a pen moving urgent and fast across a piece of American Airlines stationery. His hands, the same hands that had strangled a guitar neck on the Ed Sullivan Show 14 years ago, the same hands that had sold out arenas from Memphis to Madison Square Garden, were moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with music. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. He was 35 years old, and he was writing a letter to the President of the United States. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody in the White House or anywhere in the known world had the slightest idea that the king of rock and roll was 40,000 feet in the air, hurtling toward the Capitol, composing a handwritten letter he intended to deliver personally to Richard Nixon. This is the story of what happened when he landed. To understand why Elvis Presley was on that airplane, uninvited, unannounced, dressed in a purple velvet suit with a caped collar and gold chains thick enough to anchor a vessel, you have to understand what December of 1970 felt like when you were living inside the most famous life in America. From the outside, Elvis was everything. The boy from East Tupelo, Mississippi, born in a two-room house his father built with borrowed money, who had grown up so poor that hunger was not a metaphor but a physical fact. The teenager who walked into Sun's studio in Memphis with $18 saved from cutting grass and asked to record a song, not because he had a plan, but because something inside him refused to stay quiet. Then the world caught fire around him and never stopped burning. By 1970, Elvis had sold hundreds of millions of records. He had made 31 feature films. He had performed his legendary 1968 NBC comeback special, a leather-clad hour of television that reminded a generation that the original flame was still capable of scorching everything in its radius. He had conquered Las Vegas in a way no performer before him had managed. He was the king. But no crown comes without weight. By December of 1970, Elvis lived inside a world constructed to keep him comfortable and, in a way nobody would ever quite admit, to keep him contained. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, controlled his career with a grip so absolute that Elvis sometimes felt less like an artist and more like a product on a shelf. His inner circle, the Memphis Mafia, worshipped him and, in worshiping him, insulated him completely from any honest version of his own life. He was lonely in a way that money cannot fix, and fame actively worsens. He was also, beneath the velvet and the gold, quietly furious at the world he saw disintegrating around him. Drug culture was spreading through a generation, and it infuriated him with a particular intensity, not because he was innocent of excess, but because he saw in it a philosophical surrender that offended everything he believed in. He believed in America, in service, in the idea that a man given everything by his country owed something real in return. He believed this the way you believe things you learned in church before you were old enough to be cynical. On the night of December 20th, 1970, something broke open in him. He had been fighting with Priscilla. He had been sitting in his Bel Air mansion surrounded by gold records and yes men, and the particular silence that descends on a life when everything is provided except meaning. He picked up the phone and called his friend Jerry Schilling. "Jerry," he said, "pack a bag. We're going to Washington." No explanation. No plan. Just Elvis, certain of himself in the way that only people who have never truly been told no can be certain. On the plane, in the dark above America, Elvis wrote. He had no speechwriter, no press secretary, no legal team. He had a pen and a piece of airline stationery, and a lifetime of compressed American feeling pressing against the inside of his chest. The letter he produced that night is now one of the most celebrated documents in American history. It is preserved in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It is, statistically, the single most requested item in that archive's entire collection. More people have asked to see this handwritten letter than have asked to see the Declaration of Independence. More than the Constitution. More than any presidential correspondence in the archive's history. In it, Elvis wrote, "Dear Mr. President, first I would like to introduce myself. I am Elvis Presley and admire you and have great respect for your office. I talked to Vice President Agnew in Palm Springs 3 weeks ago and expressed my concern for our country, the drug culture, the hippie elements, the SDS, Black Panthers, etc. Do not consider me as their enemy, or as they call it, the establishment. I call it America, and I love it," he continued. "I have done an in-depth study of drug abuse and communist brainwashing techniques, and I am right in the middle of the whole thing where I can and will do the most good." Then, toward the end, the ask, he wanted to be made a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He wanted to go undercover. He, Elvis Presley, wanted a badge, whether this was the sincere gesture of a patriot who genuinely believed he could help, or the desperate reach of a man who had run out of ways to feel that his life had real purpose. History has never fully settled it. Perhaps the truest answer is that in Elvis Presley, the genuine and the theatrical were so completely fused that he himself could not always tell them apart. He signed it, Elvis Presley, folded the letter into the breast pocket of his purple velvet jacket, looked out the window at the black American sky, and waited for morning. Washington, D.C. at dawn in December is a cold, gray city that carries its own weight like an old argument nobody has resolved. The monuments rise from the river mist, looking permanent and indifferent to the personal dramas of the people who pass through them. Elvis arrived, checked into the Hotel Washington, and then did something that no White House security protocol or presidential scheduling system had ever been designed to handle. He got in a car. He drove to the White House. He walked up to the Northwest Gate. He handed the guard his letter, and he waited, standing on the sidewalk outside the most secure building in America, in his purple velvet suit and gold chains and amber aviator glasses, waiting for the most powerful institution on earth to decide what to do with him. The letter moved quickly through the building. It reached Egil Bud Krogh, a 29-year-old White House aide. Krogh read it, conferred with Deputy Assistant Dwight Chapin, then wrote a memo to Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, a memo that still exists in the National Archives, sitting beside Elvis's letter like a bureaucratic reply to a lightning bolt. Krogh wrote that the meeting would be mutually beneficial, that Elvis was sincere, that it was important to Elvis that the president grant this request. He recommended approval. Haldeman signed off at 12:30 in the afternoon on December 21, 1970. Elvis Aaron Presley was escorted through the corridors of the White House toward the Oval Office. What happens when the king of rock and roll meets the President of the United States? The answer is not what you might expect. It is not a clash of egos or a collision of worldviews. It is something far stranger and more tender. Two men recognizing something in each other. Richard Nixon was not a man comfortable in his own skin, brilliant in a way that expressed itself as paranoia, calculating in a way that looked like wisdom from some angles and like fear from others. A man who had spent his entire public life reaching toward legitimacy, toward warmth, toward belonging, and who had never quite found it no matter how high he climbed. In that way, stripped of politics, stripped of power, Nixon and Elvis were not entirely different men, both from nothing, both having clawed to the top of what America offered with a ferocity that never made peace with itself, both, in their private hours, profoundly lonely inside the monuments they had built to themselves. The Oval Office door opened. Elvis walked in. He brought a gift, an antique Colt .45 pistol, World War II commemorative, presented in a wooden case, a gesture so perfectly Elvis that it caused the Secret Service a brief and vivid moment of alarm. Before the weapon was confirmed unloaded, Nixon held it, nodded, performed composure. Then Elvis began to talk. He talked about his love for America with a directness that was, by all accounts, completely unperformed. He talked about drugs and the counterculture, and how he moved through worlds that federal agents could never penetrate because nobody looked at Elvis Presley and saw law enforcement. He criticized the Beatles by name. He told Nixon, "I am not the counterculture. I am not the establishment. I am America." Nixon listened. According to Krogh, who was present throughout the entire meeting, Nixon was genuinely engaged in a way that surprised the people who knew him. Something in Elvis's unguarded love for the country reached the president past the political calculation. Then Elvis made his ask. He wanted a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. A real one. Official. With his name on it. The Oval Office went quiet. Nixon looked at Krogh. Krogh later described the moment as a hinge in time. You could feel history deciding which way to swing. Nixon was processing not the optics, not the politics, but the simple human weight of a man sitting across from you, asking for something he genuinely believes will make a difference. Nixon said yes. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge was not a trinket. It was a genuine federal credential. The kind of thing that agents spent years earning through training and sacrifice and fieldwork. Elvis Presley received his that afternoon in the Oval Office from the President of the United States. Krogh retrieved it. It was placed into Elvis's hands. The White House photographer raised his camera. The photograph taken in that moment became, in the decades that followed, the most requested image from the entire National Archives of the United States. It has been reproduced millions of times, referenced in films, books, television shows, academic papers. By any measure, it is one of the most famous photographs ever taken inside the White House. In it, Nixon stands slightly stiff, slightly uncertain, extending his hand in the formal handshake of a man performing a role he has rehearsed. And Elvis, in the velvet and the gold and the amber glasses, leans in toward him with the easy, total confidence of a man who has never once doubted his right to be in any room he enters. But the photograph does not show what happened just before the shutter clicked. Elvis hugged Richard Nixon. He did not offer his hand. He opened his arms and stepped forward and pulled the 37th President of the United States into a full embrace. Nixon went rigid for one long half-second. The Secret Service tensed. Krogh held his breath, and then Nixon let go. He returned the embrace, not enthusiastically, not with Elvis's full-body commitment, but genuinely. He put his arms around the man and held on. Two Americans, both from nothing, both at the absolute summit of what their country offered, both carrying something inside them that the view from the top had never resolved. For one moment in the Oval Office, they held each other. And whatever that moment was, political theater or human truth, or some impossible mixture of both, it was real. Elvis left the White House that afternoon with his badge and the electric certainty of a man who believes he has just done something that matters. He called Priscilla from the car, talking fast, laughing, more alive than he had sounded in months. He meant every word. But history does not run on sincerity. The BNDD never deployed Elvis Presley as a federal undercover agent. The badge, though genuine, though official, remained a symbol, an extraordinary, uniquely American symbol of a collision between fame and power and longing, but a symbol nonetheless. Within 7 years, Elvis was dead, 42 years old, on the floor of Graceland. August 16, 1977, consumed by years of prescription dependency that the people around him had failed to prevent. Richard Nixon resigned the presidency in 1974, undone by Watergate, the dark machinery of power burying the complexity of the man beneath it. The two men never spoke again after December 21, 1970, but the letter endures. The photograph endures. A man on a plane in the American night, writing by hand to the president, asking for a chance to be something more than a spectacle, asking, in the plainest language he knew, To serve, there is something in that gesture which exceeds politics and exceeds celebrity and exceeds the comfortable laughter the story sometimes generates. Elvis Presley, for all his contradictions, and they were vast, and they eventually consumed him, loved his country with a sincerity so total it was almost painful to witness. He came from nothing, and his country gave him everything, and he never stopped trying to understand what he owed in return. On December 21st, 1970, his answer was this: show up at the gate, hand them the letter, ask for the chance to serve, and in the end, the gate opened. Because the gate always opened for Elvis. That was the most American thing about him. The badge sits today in Graceland, behind glass, in the room where Elvis kept the things that mattered most to him. Not the gold records. There are over 100 of those, not the stage costumes, or the awards, or the plaques. The badge, Federal Agent at Large, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, issued to Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll, the boy from Tupelo, the man who walked up to the White House gate on a cold December morning in a purple velvet suit, handed a guard a handwritten letter, and waited with the absolute confidence of a man who had decided that the worst they could say was no, for the world to let him in. It did. It always did. That was the most Elvis thing there ever was.